Before Bill Wilson, alcoholism was often a death sentence. And because of Bill Wilson, we now have ways to treat alcoholism and understand alcoholism and allow people to live wonderful lives, which they wouldn't have been able to do before Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous. So born in 1894, sorry about this, Bill Wilson was one of the most influential men of the 20th century. He was not a saint. He chain smoked, he took LSD, he cheated on his wife, but he was a hero. AA was founded in 1935 and has grown to have more than 2 million members at least in hundreds of countries all over the world, and there are millions of meetings. But what's even more amazing than the way AA has expanded are the dozens of other 12-step programs that AA has thrown off. In other words, it expanded this way, but also this way. There are now 12-step groups for procrastination, for cluttering, for gambling, for food. There are about 50 of them. So what Bill Wilson started, because he was trying to find a way to stop drinking, has expanded in these two amazing ways. The first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting I went to was in 1975. It was in the Presbyterian Church in Scarborough, New York, and I went with my father, who was a recovering alcoholic. Then, as you've already heard, in the year 2000, Time magazine decided to do this issue devoted to influential people of the 20th century. And they called me up and asked me to profile Bill Wilson. And I said to them, okay, send me all the books. And as you've heard, there really weren't any. There were a lot of things that hadn't been done. There were a lot of things that hadn't been said. So I thought that somebody should write a book about Bill Wilson. But of course, I didn't think it should be me. And then I had lunch with my agent, and I said to her, somebody should write a book about Bill Wilson, and she said to me, you should write a book about Bill Wilson, and so I did. And I wrote the profile of Bill Wilson, who certainly was, I came to see, one of the most influential men of the 20th century. Bill Wilson gave us a new way to think about addiction and a new way to think about alcohol. It's Bill Wilson who showed us that addiction is not a moral question. That's what people used to think, if you can believe that. That addiction is not a problem of self-control, but rather a disease with symptoms and treatment. And, you know, I happen to be writing about the Pilgrims. This is not in the speech, but I'm just riffing here. And they also have this problem that we have of thinking that drinking is great and drunkenness is terrible, right? So they say drinking is God's creature and drunkenness is from the devil. And they have a terrible time figuring out where that line is, right? Where this wonderful drinking turns into this dreadful drunkenness. But they don't know what to do about it. When they have a drunk, they put him in the stocks. They make him wear a big D on his chest, right? Until Bill Wilson, there was almost no real way to understand or engage with alcoholism. And it's just amazing, you know, even to me, that until the 1930s, really, if you were alcoholic, that was sort of it. Anyway, there were a couple of stories that stuck with me when I wrote the piece about Bill Wilson for Time magazine. One of them was his conviction that anonymity was a tremendously important part of the program that he started with Dr. Bob Smith. Now, anonymity started out as being just a way for people to avoid being known as alcoholics. There's a hilarious photograph of an early meeting in Cleveland. So it's all these men, clearly local businessmen in suits and felt hats, and they're all wearing black masks, as if that would disguise them, right? But at first, people didn't want to go to AA meetings or be part of AA because they thought that they didn't want their customers or their partners to know that they were alcoholics, and that was the beginning of anonymity. But it was part of Bill Wilson's genius. I was saying at dinner that I kind of fell in love with him, and I'm sure you'll hear that in my voice, that he realized anonymity could have a much broader scope, and that anonymity could really be a key for humility. That if people only address themselves as drunks if they didn't come into AA or come to him going, do you know who I am, right? That they would do better. And, you know, because Bill believed this so much, when they wanted Bill Wilson to be on the cover of Time in 1968, he said no. That would break my anonymity. I can't be on the cover of Time. And even more marked for me was when Yale University wanted to give him an honorary degree, he really wanted it. He got the letter from Yale and he was like, oh. So, but he knew he had to talk to a couple of other people before he accepted. So he asked his old friend Mark Whalen, who kind of made a face, and then he asked a couple of other people, and he slowly came to realize that he couldn't take the honorary degree from Yale as Bill Wilson. Because that would feed his arrogance, what he called his big shotism, and it would violate this principle of anonymity. So, you know, that's just one example of Bill Wilson taking something pretty simple, like I don't want the neighbors to know, and turning it into an incredible spiritual principle. Anyway, I was hooked, and I began writing my book about Bill Wilson. And so, Bill Wilson was, here we go, born in East Dorset, Vermont. And as you can see, on one side, in fact, the entire Bill Wilson story is visible in these shots, which I actually took, brilliant photography, of East Dorset, Vermont. So on one side, which is the top, you've got the Wilson house. And what you can't see is it's bright red. And it's got every architectural embellishment possible. It's now a hotel, actually, and it was a hotel then. And it's basically what a drunk would build if a drunk was building a big house, right? Everything you can have is on this house, and it's bright red, and there are like cats on the porch, and, you know, somebody's parked on the lawn. And then you've got the church in the middle of town, and then on the other side of church, you've got the Griffith House. Can I point this out to you? A little tiny, cramped, gray, puritanical house. So Bill Wilson's father grew up in the Wilson house, and Bill Wilson's mother grew up in the Griffith house. So you can see what the problem was right from the beginning. Anyway, they didn't get along. They had Bill, they had Dorothy, and they didn't get along for obvious reasons. One of them was a big, brilliant, lovable, blousy, philandering drunk. And the other one was a restrained, puritanical Mayflower descendant. I'm not sure what the noun should be. Provide the noun for me. And they didn't get along. And when Bill was just 11, his parents abandoned him. And they dumped him and his sister with his mother's parents, with his grandparents, who lived in that little tiny gray house at that side of the green. And that house was so small that when Bill Wilson walked down the stairs, he bumped his head. And when he wanted to read in bed, he had to stick his feet out the window. That's how small that house was. People often ask me if Bill Wilson had a drinking problem. And the answer is yes. He was just one man trying to get sober. And the last thing he ever imagined was that he would start the incredible movement that he started. So I'm just going to read you the piece from the book. It's just 3 paragraphs where he has his first drink, because I think it's such an important thing. And as you know, I'm sure, one symptom of alcoholism is a vivid memory of your first drink. So this is Bill Wilson's first drink, and he's at a very fancy cocktail party in Newport in his uniform, but he feels totally uncomfortable. Secretly writhing, he began to think about making his escape from the party when one of the sisters appeared next to him. He tried to smile and avoid saying anything stupid. Then someone put a cocktail in his hand, a Bronx cocktail it was called. The sweet drink made of gin, dry and sweet vermouth, and orange juice shimmered in its glass. This was the new drink from New York, a pretty girl standing next to him said. She knew that he would love it. Bill Wilson was a man who had decided again and again that he would never drink. I'd been told how many of my ancestors went down with it, he remembered. Standing there, a tall young soldier in uniform with a full-scale war going on inside his head, he somehow felt as if he didn't have a choice. So now the man who had said he would never drink, the man whose life had already been ruined by others drinking, gratefully accepted the Bronx cocktail. This was different. This time its effect was unmistakable. It tasted wonderful, sweet and airy at the same time. Orange juice and gin are a time-honored drink because of the way they combine to relax and energize. It tasted so good that it was gone in what seemed like a moment. The second Bronx cocktail was what really did the trick. Suddenly, the gawky soldier felt completely at home in this fancy crowd. The pretty girl, his new best friend, guided him around, introducing him to her friends. Bill laughed and relaxed and told stories. Everyone laughed with him. And this is a quote from him. "That strange barrier that had existed between me and all men and women, even the closest, seemed to instantly go down," he remembered. The scene went from being a nightmare to being beautiful. I could talk well. I could actually please the guests. Bill had ascended into the top ranks of society with just a few drinks, and he thought he had found the elixir of life. After he had been invited to return another time and made many new plans with his friends, he stepped out into the driveway of the house enthralled. Behind him, he could hear soft saxophone music. As he walked down the drive through the fragrant summer night, he moved as easily as if invisible chains had fallen away. He felt a new kind of freedom. I was part of things at last, he remembered. Oh, the magic of those first 3 or 4 drinks. From 1917 to 1934, he lost everything over and over again. He promised to stop, but he couldn't stop. For instance, he decided that he wanted to work at Thomas Edison's lab in New Jersey. Thomas Edison had set up this lab, and he invited, Bill saw an ad in the paper that said, do you want to come work for Thomas Edison? So he said, absolutely. So Thomas Edison had invented or was giving a kind of early SAT test where he gave a lot of young men a kind of general knowledge test. So Bill went out to the Edison labs in New Jersey and he took the test and he passed with flying colors. He was the kind of guy who knew everything. And Edison was really impressed, and Edison offered him a job tailor-made for him. And Bill said, it's too far away. So, to my mind, that's alcoholism. Then he decided he wanted to get a law degree, so he went and got the credits, but then he couldn't quite pick up the degree. He never quite graduated. So that kind of aspect of alcoholism that some of us know so well, where you have all these good intentions and then the whole thing just kind of disintegrates in your hands, that began to happen to him. Slowly, the pieces that would eventually become Alcoholics Anonymous were falling into place in Bill Wilson's mind, even though he didn't know it. What he didn't really have was any kind of idea that drinking had anything to do with God or religion or anything like that. He didn't have that yet. He didn't quite understand that piece yet. But on his third visit to Towns Hospital, he fell on his knees and he called out to help. He said, God, if you're there, show yourself angrily. And his room, as he writes it, which I'm not going to read this part, was filled with this blazing white light, which Bill took to be the presence of God and the voice of God. And after that, Bill Wilson never had another drink. So, as you can see, Bill Wilson was no saint in the sense that he wasn't perfect. But it was his humanity, his imperfection, his search for some kind of peace in his own life that led him to find a way that has helped millions of people and that has changed the way we think about our own natures and about addiction. Or maybe that, what I just read, is the definition of a saint. Thank you.